The old Pinehurst Manor stood shrouded in mist at the edge of Hollow Creek, its decaying walls splintered by time and silence. Locals swore they heard whispers from within, a chorus of voices mingling with the wind, carrying tales of lost souls and unfinished deeds. Most avoided the manor, but Ethan, a thrill-seeking journalist, saw an opportunity for a story that could make his name. Ethan arrived at dusk, his camera and notebook clutched tightly. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and moss. As he pushed open the wrought iron gate, it screeched like a warning. The house loomed larger with every step, dark windows like hollow eyes, watching his approach. He hesitated, feeling a strange chill crawl up his spine. "Pull it together, Ethan," he muttered, forcing a grin. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Ignoring the nagging voice in his head, he stepped inside. The foyer was a cavernous space filled with dust motes dancing in the beam of his flashlight. The floor creaked beneath his boots, each sound echoing as if the house were breathing. Decayed portraits lined the walls, their subjects obscured by shadows and grime. One painting, larger than the rest, depicted a young woman with pale, empty eyes. Her stare seemed to follow him as he moved. Ethan focused on his task, raising the camera to snap photos. The flash lit the room in bursts, revealing an ornate chandelier above, and faded tapestries drooping from their rods. The musty silence pressed in until, suddenly, it was broken by a faint thump from upstairs. Just the house settling, he reassured himself. Yet, a cold sweat dampened his brow. He ventured further into the manor, finding the library. Shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten tomes, their spines cracked and titles unreadable. As he examined an old journal, a whisper caressed his ear, soft and breathy, unmistakably human. "Leave." Ethan spun around, heart thundering, but he was alone. His flashlight trembled in his hand as he scanned the dark corners. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched grew more intense. He shook his head, cursing his overactive imagination. The whisper returned, louder, more insistent. "Leave. Now." Panic tightened his chest, but he fought it down. He was here for a story, not ghost stories. He ascended the cracked staircase, each step creaking underfoot. The air grew colder as he reached the second floor, where the whispers became a symphony of hushed voices, pleading, warning. At the end of the hall was a room with a slightly ajar door. He pushed it open to find an old bedroom, preserved as if its owner might return at any moment. An oval mirror on the dresser caught his attention. He approached it, shining his flashlight over its tarnished surface. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed and pale. But behind him, in the shadowy doorway, stood the woman from the portrait. Her eyes were no longer empty. They burned with a dark, inhuman light. Ethan gasped and turned, but the room was empty. The whispers rose to a frantic pitch, blending into a dissonant wail that drilled into his mind. He staggered back, crashing into the dresser. The mirror shattered, and the room fell silent. Shards of glass sparkled on the floor like frozen stars, and one large piece reflected the face of the woman, her mouth open in a silent scream. A soft touch on his shoulder made him whip around. No one was there, yet he felt a cold breath on his neck, as if someone were right behind him watching. The voices surged again, a wave of sound that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "Leave while you can." This time, Ethan didn't hesitate. He bolted for the stairs, but as he reached the top step, the floorboards beneath him buckled. He fell hard, hitting the landing below. Pain lanced through his arm, but he scrambled to his feet, ignoring it. He glanced back only once to see the silhouette of the woman, standing at the top of the stairs, watching him with eyes full of malice and sorrow. He sprinted to the front door, only to find it stuck. He yanked and kicked at it desperately, feeling the air grow heavier, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The whispers became laughter, high-pitched and mocking, as if the house itself was amused by his struggle. Suddenly, a crack splintered the air, and the door burst open, sending him sprawling onto the cold grass outside. The night was eerily silent. Even the crickets had ceased their song. Ethan lay there for a moment, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the manor. The woman's pale face appeared in the window, watching him with an expression that seemed almost relieved. He stumbled to his car, slamming the door and speeding away, gravel crunching under his tires. Only when he was miles away did he pull over, hands shaking uncontrollably. The whispers had stopped, but in the silence of the night, he could still hear them echoing in his mind. The next day, he returned to the site with a crew, determined to capture the story. But when they arrived, Pinehurst Manor was nothing but ruins, charred and blackened as if it had burned down years ago. Ethan stood frozen as a cold realization washed over him. Clutched in his hand was a piece of the broken mirror, a fragment that still reflected the haunted eyes of the woman, now at peace but trapped forever in its silvery depths. Ethan couldn't shake the unease that followed him home. Days passed, yet his mind remained tethered to Pinehurst Manor, and the reflection in the mirror shard that now lay on his desk, covered in a cloth. It whispered to him at night, soft and relentless, as if the manor's secrets had followed him. "Set me free." He tried to dismiss it as his imagination. Sleep came in fits, haunted by dreams of the woman with empty eyes and a burning stare. In the dream, she stood in a hallway lined with broken mirrors, her outstretched hand dripping black liquid that pulsed like a heartbeat. Each night, the dream would end the same way. She would press her cold hand against his chest, whispering, "We are bound." One morning, Ethan awoke drenched in sweat, the echo of her touch still fresh on his skin. Determined to put an end to his torment, he researched the history of Pinehurst Manor. Local archives spoke of a wealthy family, the Hargraves, who had vanished one stormy night in the late 1800s. The manor had caught fire, but no remains were ever found. One entry caught his eye. Amelia Hargrave, a daughter known for her reclusive nature and rumored fascination with the occult. Ethan's pulse quickened. Amelia must have been the woman in the portrait, and in his reflection. But what did she want with him? The answer came unexpectedly that evening. The whispers that plagued him for days reached a fever pitch, swirling around his apartment. The air thickened, stifling him, and the lights flickered wildly. The covered mirror shard on his desk glowed with a faint blue light. Dread knotted in his stomach as he approached it. "Release me," a voice said, clearer than before. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was Amelia's voice. He reached for the cloth and pulled it away. The shard shimmered, the surface warping as if it were liquid. Ethan's reflection was replaced by the image of Amelia, her eyes pleading. She mouthed silent words that he somehow understood. "Help me break free." "What?" Ethan hesitated. His rational mind screamed at him to throw the shard away, but something deep within told him this was his only chance to rid himself of her ghostly presence. With trembling fingers, he picked up the shard. It was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of numbness up his arm. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness, and a strong wind surged through, knocking over books and scattering papers. The shard grew colder, biting into his skin until he winced in pain. Amelia's image shifted, her eyes wide with fear. "Beware the binding," she whispered. Before he could react, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. It moved with impossible speed, twisting and undulating like black smoke. It coalesced behind him, heavy and suffocating, a presence that reeked of rot and despair. Ethan turned to see it take shape, a figure of emptiness, eyes glowing with the same dark light I'd seen in the manor. The shard in his hand cracked, a sound like ice fracturing underfoot. Amelia's voice screamed in desperation. "You must break the chain." Ethan gripped the shard tighter, and did the only thing that made sense in that moment. He hurled it at the apparition. The glass splintered midair, sending tiny fragments into the dark figure. A blinding light erupted, filling the room with searing brilliance. The shadow howled, a sound that tore through the walls and seemed to shatter reality itself. For a moment, Ethan thought he could see Amelia standing next to him, her face free of torment, whispering a final "thank you." Then, everything was still. The wind died, the whispers ceased, and the room settled into silence. Ethan fell to his knees, gasping for breath. He glanced at his hands. They were empty. The shard and the shadow were gone. Weeks passed and life slowly returned to normal. Yet every now and then, when night fell and the house was quiet, Ethan would catch a glimpse of movement in the mirror. A fleeting shadow. A shimmer that whispered of freedom earned in darkness averted. But deep down, he knew. The binding was broken, but some bonds once made never truly fade. Ethan resumed his life with a semblance of normalcy, yet a residual tension clung to him. Every night, when he would look in the mirror, he expected to see the faintest shimmer or catch an echo of that voice. But Amelia's whispers were gone, replaced with silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed into his mind, like the pause before a storm. One night, as he reviewed notes for a new article, there was a knock at his door. The clock on the wall showed midnight. His breath caught as he stood, heart thudding against his ribcage. He approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the empty corridor, dimly lit by a flickering bulb. A nervous laugh escaped him. "You get a grippy," he thought, and turned back to his desk. But before he sat down, a second knock, louder, insistent, echoed through the room. He spun around, pulse racing. This time, without hesitation, he flung the door open. No one was there. The hall stretched in either direction, silent and unchanged, except for a peculiar chill that made his skin prickle. He took a step back to close the door when he noticed a small object lying on the threshold. Squatting down, he picked up what appeared to be an old yellowed envelope. Scrawled across its surface in elegant handwriting was his name, Ethan Carteret. Inside was a folded piece of parchment. Unfurling it, he read, "I warned you. You are part of it now. Very soon. Concert." The handwriting was familiar, though he couldn't place it. It sent a shiver down his spine. He looked around again, expecting someone to step out of the shadows, but the corridor was as lifeless as before. Suddenly, the hallway light buzzed and went out, plunging him into near darkness. He backed into his apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The room seemed darker than it had before, even with the lamps turned on. Shadows pooled in the corners, deeper than they should have been. Then came the noise, a rhythmic thumping, like someone walking slowly down a long corridor, but it came from inside his apartment. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for his phone, but it fell from his grasp and skidded under the couch. He crouched to retrieve it when he saw something move in the reflection of the mirror hanging on the wall opposite him. There, just behind him, stood a tall figure wrapped in shadow. It wore the hint of a human form, but was defined only by the darkness it held. Its eyes glimmered with the same dark light as before, hollow and unrelenting. "Did you think it would be so simple?" A voice rasped from the depths of the figure. It sounded like Amelia, but distorted, twisted by layers of pain and something far worse. Ethan's voice caught in his throat. He backed against the wall, his heart a wild drum beat. The shadow moved forward, inching closer until it was mere feet away. It raised a hand, the air around it crackling with an unnatural chill. "Amelia freed you," he whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it true. But the figure only shifted its head slightly, eyes narrowing. "She tried," it said, the voice now a blend of many. Amelia's, the whispers from the manor, and something darker that Ethan recognized as the presence that had haunted him. But some bindings were never meant to break. The room grew colder, frost creeping across the window panes, and Ethan's breath turned to mist. He felt an invisible force tightening around his chest. Just when he thought he could take no more, the figure leaned closer, eyes locking onto his. "Now, you're mine," it whispered. And then the world spun into darkness. When Ethan awoke, he was lying on the cold floor of his apartment, dawn's first light casting long, pale shadows through the window. The room was quiet, normal, as if nothing had happened. But deep in his mind, he could hear a soft, familiar whisper. It was not Amelia this time, but a remnant of the shadow itself, a sinister promise that echoed in the silence. This is only the beginning. John, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The morning light filtered through his blinds, casting long gray beams across his floor. Yet, the warmth of the sun did nothing to ease the chill that had taken hold of him. He sat up slowly, his body still sore, his mind racing. The shadow, the voice, it was all too real. He felt a strange, gnawing pull toward the mirror, as though it was no longer just a reflection, but a portal to something far darker. As he stood and walked toward the mirror, he glanced at the cracked shard of glass on his desk. His hand trembled as he picked it up again. This time, though, the shard didn't feel cold. Instead, it felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with a faint rhythmic beat beneath his fingers. He turned it over and over in his hands, feeling its power but also its weight. A weight he hadn't felt before. The whisper came again, louder this time, like it was inside his head. "You can't escape. Wanasula." Ethan jumped back, his breath quickening. The voice was no longer distant. It felt as if it was standing right beside him in the room. He turned around, his heart pounding. There was nothing there. Just the stillness of his apartment, the dim light streaming in, and the quiet hum of his refrigerator. But he wasn't alone. The reflection in the mirror changed. The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. His own face blurred out of view, replaced by a vast, shadowy expanse, swirling and churning with dark shapes that seemed to pulse in the periphery. And there, amidst the whirl of blackness, stood the figure again, this time closer than ever, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. "You thought you could banish me?" The voice was calm, menacing. Amelia tried. "You will fail as she did." The figure's form became clearer, his features sharp and cruel, the eyes now burning with malice. Ethan's legs went weak, his breath shallow. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't move. The whispering grew louder, maddening in its cadence, as though the walls were closing in on him. He looked at the mirror again. In it, the shadow moved, stretching toward him like a hand reaching from beyond. "Stop," Ethan gasped, clutching the shard tighter. The edges of the glass dug into his palm, drawing blood. For a moment, there was stillness. The figure's face contorted, twisting into a grotesque grin. It seemed to savor his fear. "You can't banish what's already inside you," it hissed. "You are bound to me, to us." Suddenly, the world around Ethan seemed to shift. The air grew thick, pressing down on him. His vision blurred. His mind felt as if it was being pulled in different directions. The whispers grew louder, deafening, until they were no longer whispers but commands. Commands Ethan couldn't ignore. His vision faltered, and he staggered backward. The walls around him seemed to bend, the room distorting as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, his body moved. His feet carried him toward the door against his will. His hand reached for the knob, and when the door creaked open, he stepped outside, into the dark streets. The city was silent, desolate. No cars, no lights, no sounds of life. It was as though the entire world had been swallowed by a void, leaving nothing but the suffocating silence that echoed in his ears. He turned around, and the figure was there again, emerging from the shadows, a twisted silhouette against the night sky. Its eyes gleamed like burning coals. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice deep and resonant, the words vibrating in Ethan's chest. "We are one." Ethan could feel it now, the pull inside him, a darkness creeping through his veins, filling him with an insatiable hunger. The shard in his hand began to hum with energy, pulling him closer to the figure. He felt his will slipping away, drowning in the overwhelming force of the presence before him. The shadow reached out, its long fingers brushing against his arm, and Ethan screamed. His voice lost in the void. But then, as if from nowhere, a new voice broke through the suffocating silence. "Ethan." The voice was familiar, soft, and filled with urgency. It was Amelia. Her image flickered, like a dying light, in his mind's eye. "Amelia." Ethan gasped, his body trembling with the effort to fight the shadow's hold. "Listen to me. You can still fight this," she urged, her voice growing fainter. "You were never meant to be a part of this. You can stop it. Just let go of the mirror." The darkness around him pulsed again, as if mocking her words. The shadow's grip tightened, and the air grew colder, suffocating. "Let go." Amelia whispered one last time, before her voice faded into nothingness. Ethan's eyes flickered between the shadow and the mirror shard in his hand. It pulsed, burning with energy. His hand was shaking violently, and for a moment he thought he might drop it. But something inside him stirred, something he hadn't felt before. A surge of defiance, a refusal to surrender. With all the strength he could muster, he hurled the shard into the air, watching as it shattered, its pieces scattering like stars across the dark sky. The shadow screeched, its form unraveling as the shards of glass reflected its face. Contorted, panicked, and full of rage, the darkness started to dissipate, its presence shrinking into nothingness, like a candle being snuffed out. The world around Ethan began to stabilize, the oppressive silence lifting. The city returned to its normal state, the faint hum of life returning. The mirror shard had vanished, leaving nothing behind but a strange sense of peace. But as he stood there alone in the quiet street, Ethan could still feel it, deep inside him, like a seed waiting to sprout. The bond had been broken, but it wasn't gone. It would never be gone. And somewhere in the distance, he swore he could hear the faintest whisper. "Oh, he's watching." Wah. Soon. Ethan stood motionless in the middle of the street, his heart hammering against his ribs as the last remnants of the shadow disappeared into the night. The air felt lighter, but not entirely free of the oppressive weight that had clung to him for so long. The city, which moments ago had felt like an empty shell, now seemed too normal, too quiet. He couldn't shake the sense that he hadn't truly escaped, that the darkness hadn't been destroyed. It had only retreated, waiting for the right moment to return. His hands trembled as he looked around, half expecting the shadow to reappear, but the street remained still and silent. He let out a shaky breath and began walking back toward his apartment, his footsteps echoing in the empty night. The air felt colder now, a biting chill that gnawed at his bones, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating dread that had once gripped him. As he stepped back inside his apartment, the familiar surroundings did little to comfort him. The mirrors seemed to watch him, their reflective surfaces impossibly still, as though they were waiting for something to happen. Ethan tried to ignore them, but his gaze was drawn to the one on the far wall. It had been undisturbed, just as it had been before, but now it felt different, darker. The room's reflections seemed slightly distorted, as though the glass itself was warping, unwilling to reveal the truth. He walked toward it, his feet heavy with the dread he couldn't shake. The whispering began again, faint at first, but growing louder as he drew closer to the mirror. His fingers grazed the edge of the frame, and suddenly the temperature dropped. A breath of cold air rushed past him, sending chills down his spine. The reflection began to change. This time there was no shadow, no distorted face. Instead, he saw his own face, only it wasn't quite his. His eyes were hollow, dark, and the expression on his face was twisted in a way that he couldn't comprehend. It was as though someone else was staring back at him, someone who had taken his place. "No," he whispered, stumbling backward. This isn't me." The figure in the mirror smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort or reassurance. It was a grin of pure malice. Ethan's reflection reached out, placing a hand on the glass as if to touch him. The glass rippled under the pressure of the hand, like water disturbed by an unseen force. "You can't escape," the reflection said, its voice cold and mocking, echoing in the room. "You belong to us now." Ethan's pulse raced. His head spun as panic gripped him. He backed away from the mirror, but the image of his reflection stayed locked in place. The room began to feel smaller, the walls closing in on him. The whispers, once faint, now filled the space, swirling around him like a storm. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. His breath caught in his throat as he slowly turned around, but there was nothing there. He glanced back at the mirror, and his reflection had stepped out of the frame. It was now standing in the room with him, the figure that looked like him. "No?" Wasim reached out, its hand cold and grasping. Ethan could feel it. The touch was not his own. It was a dark, foreign sensation, one that crawled beneath his skin. "You didn't think you could just leave, did you?" the reflection said, its voice seeping into Ethan's mind. "We are bound together, and now there's no escape." Ethan backed away in horror, but the reflection followed, its steps silent and predatory. His heart raced as he tried to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The more he struggled, the stronger the pull became. "Amelia!" he gasped, feeling her presence again. Oh, she had warned him. She had told him that the binding was never truly broken, only delayed. He wasn't free. With desperation growing in his chest, Ethan reached out to the shard of glass on his desk, now shattered and scattered across the surface. He gathered the pieces, his hands trembling as they fit together like a broken puzzle, and held them tightly in his palm. The reflection smiled wider, his eyes burning with cruel amusement. It won't matter. You will never be free of us. But Ethan, with what little strength he had left, threw the shard toward the reflection. The moment it made contact with the mirror, the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. The room seemed to tremble, the very air vibrating with energy. The darkness around Ethan roared to life, swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw before everything turned black was the reflection's face. His face, grinning as it dissolved into the shattered fragments. Then, nothing. When Ethan awoke, he was lying in his bed, drenched in sweat, his heart still racing. The sun had risen, casting a soft light over the room. He blinked, confused, disoriented. Was it all a dream? The fear, the whispers, the mirror. It had felt so real. He sat up slowly, his legs weak. The room appeared normal. No shadows, no dark figure, but the silence felt heavy, like it was hiding something. He looked toward the wall, where the mirror had been, but it was gone. Instead, there was a crack in the wall, thin and jagged, like something had been forced through it. Ethan reached out to touch it, his fingers brushing against the rough edges. The crack pulsed under his touch, as though something on the other side was still moving. Then, from somewhere deep inside the crack, he heard it. The faintest whisper, just barely audible. "We are always watching." Ethan froze. His heart sank as the words echoed in his mind, and he knew with chilling certainty that it wasn't over. The shadow had never truly left. It had only been waiting for the right moment to strike again. And this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was inside him, crawling beneath his skin, waiting for the moment when he would finally give in. Ethan's mind raced as he stood before the crack in the wall. The whisper lingered in his ears, like a faint breeze brushing against his skin, but carrying with it the weight of something far darker. The words, "X-Way are always watching," felt like a poison, sinking into his very soul. His fingers trembled as they traced the jagged edges of the crack. He pulled his hand away quickly, as though touching it might pull him into the void on the other side. It's not real, he tried to convince himself. It's just a nightmare, a hallucination. But as he glanced around the room, nothing felt familiar anymore. The light, though soft and natural, seemed too bright, too harsh. The shadows lingered in the corners, stretching toward him as if reaching out. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as he tried to make sense of what was happening. With shaking hands, he grabbed his jacket and hurried out the door, as if leaving his apartment might somehow break the spell that had him trapped in this nightmare. The streets outside were quiet, too quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, not even the usual hum of distant traffic. It was as though the entire world had been muted, left in suspended animation. Ethan moved through the empty streets, his steps echoing off the concrete. Each footfall a reminder of the surreal, oppressive silence that weighed on him. He had to escape. He had to get away from the mirrors, from the darkness that followed him. But no matter how far he walked, the feeling of being watched never left. Every street he turned onto seemed to lead him back to the same place, his apartment. The crack in the wall, the whisper in his mind. His thoughts were a whirlwind, tangled and suffocating. And soon he found himself standing in front of the old, abandoned building he had been investigating before everything started. It stood tall, its windows shattered, its doors ajar, as if inviting him back inside. A part of him screamed to turn away, to forget the place that had marked the beginning of his descent into this nightmare. But another part of him, the same part that had been drawn to the mirror, the whispers, the shadow, knew that he had to go in. He was tied to this place, to the darkness within it. He pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing through the hollow emptiness of the building. The air inside was thick, heavy with the smell of decay and dust. His footsteps stirred the silence, disturbing the layers of grime that had built up over the years. The faintest flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned quickly, but nothing was there. Just shadows stretching across the cracked walls. The building was alive in a way he couldn't explain. It hummed with energy, a low vibration that rattled his bones. It was as if it knew he was there, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. "Ethan." The voice came from nowhere, but it was unmistakably Amelia's. Soft, urgent, desperate. "You have to leave. It's not what you think." He turned, searching the darkness for any sign of her, but all he saw was the shifting shadows, the twisted forms of the building's broken interior. His breath came in shallow gasps, panic rising in his chest. "Amelia," he called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Where are you?" But the only answer was the sound of his own heartbeat thumping in his ears. He took a step forward, then another, drawn deeper into the heart of the building, unable to resist the pull. As he moved through the halls, the walls seemed to close in on him. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The whispering grew louder, no longer just a murmur, but a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all filling his mind with terrible truths. "Ethan, you can't escape. You belong to us." He stumbled, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. The floor beneath him felt uneven, as if the building itself was shifting, responding to his presence. And then, in the distance, he saw it. The mirror. It stood in the center of the room, an imposing figure that seemed to pulse with dark energy. He froze, his heart in his throat. The mirror was like a magnet, drawing him toward it. As he stepped closer, the reflections around him began to warp and twist. He saw not just his own face, but the faces of others. Strangers, some of them familiar, others completely alien. They grinned at him, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths stretched in unnatural smiles. And there, standing in the reflection, was the shadow. It loomed behind him, its presence like a suffocating weight. Its eyes, dark and burning, stared into his soul, and its voice filled his head, a low, growling whisper. "You thought you could resist, but you were always ours. You just didn't know it." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the darkness that had now completely surrounded him. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand slowly pressing against the glass. The surface rippled, and Ethan felt a cold, sickening chill crawl up his spine as the mirror began to distort. The reflection of the shadow stretching toward him. "You're not leaving. Not this time," the shadow said, its voice now echoing from the depths of the mirror. The glass trembled as if something was trying to break through from the other side. Ethan could feel the air thickening, pressing down on him, squeezing the life out of him. His lungs burned as he gasped for breath, and then, as if on cue, the mirror shattered. Shards of glass flew through the air, cutting into his skin as the darkness poured out, swallowing him whole. Ethan awoke, gasping for air. His body was drenched in sweat, and his heart raced like it might burst from his chest. He blinked rapidly, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was real. But nothing felt real anymore. The room around him was eerily quiet, the shadows too still. His breath trembled in the heavy silence, the air thick with a lingering sense of dread. The whisper returned, soft and insistent, crawling into his mind. "We are always watching." Ethan's head snapped toward the corner of the room. There, in the darkness, he saw it. His reflection, staring back at him with hollow eyes, a twisted grin stretching across its face. And just like that, he understood. The shadow had been chasing him. It had been inside him all along, and it would never leave. Ethan's heart thudded against his chest as he lay frozen in bed, his eyes locked on the reflection in the corner of the room. His own face stared back at him, or at least that's what he thought at first. The eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were not his. The grin that twisted across the face was cruel, mocking. It was him, but not. It was eyeing something else, something dark and ancient, and it had been waiting for him, for the moment he would finally see the truth. "You can't escape." The whisper slithered into his mind again, a venomous hiss that made his skin crawl. The reflection in the corner grinned wider. The air felt dense, as though it had become thick with smoke. Ethan's breath became shallow, his limbs heavy as if they were being pulled into the earth. The weight of the darkness pressing down on him was unbearable. He tried to move, but his body betrayed him. With every breath, the reflection seemed to grow closer, inching toward him like a shadow that would consume him whole. His own voice echoed in his mind, distorted and faint. This is a dream. It has to be a dream. But it wasn't. The coldness that wrapped around him was too real, the silence in the room too suffocating. His fingers twitched, the smallest movement, but it was enough to break the trance. He rolled over quickly, scrambling out of bed. The reflection stayed where it was, still watching, still grinning. It felt like the room was collapsing around him, as though the walls were closing in, squeezing him tighter with each passing second. He ran for the door, his legs unsteady beneath him. As his hand gripped the doorknob, he froze. The air shifted again. The temperature dropped, and the whispering grew louder, as if the walls themselves were alive with it. "You can't leave. You belong to us." The door wouldn't budge. His body slammed against it in desperation, but it felt as though the entire building was pressing back against him. The mirror's presence grew behind him, pressing against his back like an invisible force. He turned slowly, afraid of what he might see, but when he looked, there was nothing, just darkness. And then, the voice came again. Only now it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, sharp, like someone speaking directly into his ear. "Turn around, Ethan." His body moved before his mind could process it. He turned. There, in the middle of the room, stood the mirror again. This time, it wasn't the same cracked, shattered piece of glass. It was whole, perfect, and the reflection was no longer just a dark version of himself. The figure in the mirror was different, taller, more imposing, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn into his soul. "It's time to join us." Ethan's body stiffened. He tried to move, to flee, but his feet felt as if they were stuck to the floor, like invisible chains were holding him in place. The figure in the mirror reached out, slowly at first, but with an undeniable certainty. Its fingers brushed against the glass, and the entire surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone. The dark energy from the mirror reached out, tendrils of shadow that seemed to stretch toward him, toward his very essence. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The darkness had him now, its claws wrapped around him like a vice. There was no way out. There never had been. The reflection's grin widened, as though savoring his fear. And then, the mirror shattered. Not in the way it had before. This time, the glass didn't just break. It exploded outward, shards flying like daggers, piercing the air. Ethan screamed, raising his arms to shield his face, but it was useless. The glass passed right through him, not leaving a single mark. The shards clattered to the floor, but they didn't stay on the ground. They hovered down, swirling around him like a vortex of sharp, jagged pieces. And then the shadows surged forward, overwhelming him. "You're mine now." The voice was everywhere, inescapable. It seemed to come from the shattered glass, from the air around him, from the very walls. The room around him seemed to distort, to melt into something that was no longer real, but a nightmare. Alive, breathing, watching him. He felt himself being pulled into it. The shadows surrounded him, swallowing him whole, suffocating him. His body twisted and writhed as if being drawn into the mirror itself, his limbs contorting in unnatural angles, his mind fraying at the edges. His body couldn't take it. He couldn't breathe. He could feel himself, losing himself. But then, through the chaos, a voice, a familiar voice, cut through the darkness. "Ethan, listen to me. You're not alone." He blinked, his head spinning, and there, standing before him, was Amelia. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but her voice was strong. "You can still fight it. You have to." Ethan's mind barely registered the words. The shadows were too powerful, too relentless. But something in Amelia's voice made him fight back. He felt a flicker of hope, a small spark that hadn't been completely consumed by the darkness. Amelia was still here. She hadn't left. She was reaching out to him. With a force he didn't know he had left, Ethan forced his hand toward the shadows, gripping the shard of glass that had appeared in his palm. The energy in the room seemed to pulse as his fingers tightened around it. The glass began to glow, crackling with a strange, otherworldly power. "It's not too late," Amelia said, her voice growing fainter, but still filled with urgency. "You are stronger than this. You can still break free." The shadows recoiled at the light from the glass, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he had control. The darkness shrieked, twisting and writhing as if it was in pain. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. He pushed harder, his mind screaming in defiance as the darkness shrank away from the light. "No, no," the shadow's voice screamed, a twisted, guttural cry that seemed to reverberate through the very air around him. The shadows faltered, and with one final burst of energy, the darkness shattered, the room returning to its eerie silence. The broken pieces of the mirror fell to the floor, the last remnants of the shadow vanishing into the cracks. Amelia's figure flickered one last time, her voice a whisper in the air. "You are free, Ethan. But remember, the darkness never truly leaves." And then, like a fading dream, she was gone. Ethan stood in the stillness, the weight of the battle still pressing on him. The room was empty now. No shadows, no whispering voices, just the quiet hum of life. But deep inside him, he knew the truth. The darkness wasn't gone. It was inside him, waiting for the moment to return. And this time, when it did, it would be even harder to escape. But for now, Ethan was free, at least for a little while. Ethan woke with a start, his chest heaving as if he had been running for miles. His eyes shot open, scanning the dimly lit room, trying to orient himself. The feeling of suffocating dread from the night before still clung to him like a heavy cloak, pressing in on him from all sides. He quickly pushed himself upright, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. He was drenched in sweat, but there was no shadow, no oppressive darkness. It had all been a dream, hadn't it? The mirror, the whispers, the suffocating blackness, Amelia's voice. He ran a shaky hand through his hair, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it been real? Or was it just a fragment of his mind, twisted and warped by the stress of the past few weeks? But when he looked around the room, everything seemed in order. His bed was unmade, the light streaming in through the cracks in the curtains, casting a soft glow over the walls. The clock on his nightstand blinked 3:15 a.m., its red digits casting a faint glow in the otherwise quiet room. Ethan slowly exhaled. "It's over. It's just a nightmare," he repeated to himself. More to reassure his racing mind than anything else. But then, a subtle shift in the air made him freeze. It was almost imperceptible, like a barely noticeable breeze or the slightest change in temperature. Ethan's pulse quickened, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room again. His heart thudded in his chest, a primal sense of unease settling over him. And that's when he saw it. On the far wall, right where the window cast a strip of light across the floor, a dark smudge had appeared. A crack in the plaster, jagged and unnatural, running from the floor to the ceiling. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "No, not again. Oh, no." He stumbled out of bed, his legs weak beneath him, but his feet moved toward the crack almost against his will. The closer he got, the more it seemed to pulse, the darkness within it swirling and shifting like something alive. He reached out a trembling hand, and as soon as his fingers brushed against the wall, the whisper returned. "You can't escape." The voice slithered in his mind, cold and guttural, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a vice. He recoiled, pulling his hand away, but it was too late. The crack widened, stretching, and the darkness began to spill out from it, thick and inky, as if the crack was a gateway to something far worse. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor, his body unwilling to move. His hands were shaking violently, his body trembling in the presence of the dark force that had returned to claim him. Suddenly, the room grew cold. So cold that Ethan could see his breath in the air. He turned, desperately trying to find an escape, but the door was locked, the window shut tight. There was no way out. The shadows pressed in from all sides, the air thick with the stench of decay and rot. "You belong to us now," the whisper returned, louder this time, filling the room with its malicious promise. Ethan closed his eyes, shaking his head, desperate to wake up from the nightmare. But when he opened them again, he wasn't in his room anymore. The world around him had changed. The walls had disappeared, and he was standing in a vast, empty void, an endless, swirling blackness that stretched out into eternity. The floor beneath him felt unstable, shifting with every step he took. It was like he was walking on air, his feet hovering above nothingness. In the distance, he saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed an eerie, unnatural red. His presence radiated power, ancient and cold. And as it moved closer, Ethan felt his body growing heavier, his limbs growing weak, as if the very air was pressing down on him. The figure stepped into the dim light that seemed to flicker and pulse around them, and Ethan saw its face, twisted, featureless, except for the eyes. Those eyes, they were full of rage, full of hunger, full of an evil that seemed to go beyond this world. It spoke, its voice like the rumble of thunder, deep and resonating. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You will never be free, Ethan. You are ours now, and we will never let you go." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the force of the words striking him like a physical blow. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the weight of the shadow's presence crushed him. The void around him seemed to close in, the walls pressing in from all directions, suffocating him. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. Someone. It was Amelia. She was standing far off, her face pale but determined. She didn't look afraid. Her eyes locked onto his, and she took a step forward, her voice carrying across the darkness. "Ethan, you are stronger than this. You can fight it." Her words cut through the oppressive air like a blade, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a spark of hope. He turned toward her, his body trembling, but somehow finding the strength to stand. "Amelia, help me," he called out, his voice hoarse. But the shadow figure did not falter. It raised its hand, and the very fabric of reality seemed to shudder. The shadows writhed and twisted around them like serpents coiling around their prey. Amelia's image flickered, her form warping, as if the darkness itself was trying to tear her away. Ethan's chest tightened with panic. He couldn't lose her again. Not like this. "Amelia, no," he screamed, his voice breaking. His hands clenched into fists, his nails biting into his palms. The figure's laugh echoed around them, low and mocking. "You think she can save you? You're nothing but a toy, a vessel. And now, you will learn your place." Suddenly, Ethan felt a surge of energy. It wasn't his own. It was something else. Something older. Something deeper. The shadows around him seemed to retreat, just for a moment as if they were afraid. His hands shot out, and the darkness shrank back, recoiling from him as though burned. "You will not take her from me," Ethan shouted, his voice full of rage. The shadows howled in fury, but he pushed them back, feeling the power coursing through him. A power that he had never known he had. Amelia stepped forward again, her form solidifying. She reached out, her hand catching his. "We can do this together," she said, her voice soft but steady. And in that moment, Ethan understood. The darkness was not just a force outside of him. It was inside him, but so was the light. And as long as he held on to that light, as long as he fought for it, the darkness could never truly win. With Amelia's strength beside him, Ethan pushed forward, his mind locked on the light that was beginning to break through the oppressive shadow. The figure screamed as the darkness cracked, splitting apart, shattering into pieces like glass falling from the sky. But as the last remnants of the shadow dissipated, Ethan knew that it was not over. The darkness would always return, and when it did, he would be ready. Ethan's breath came in heavy gasps as the remnants of the dark figure dissolved into nothingness, leaving only a lingering sense of dread in the air. The void around him had fractured, its oppressive grip loosening, and the ground beneath his feet became solid again. He glanced at Amelia, who stood beside him, her expression grim but resolute. "You've done it," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight of something unspoken, something they both understood now, though there was a tension in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that their victory wasn't permanent, that this battle was far from over. Ethan took a step back, his body still trembling, his skin cold with the after effects of the darkness. The last remnants of the shadow seemed to fade into the ether, but there was something strange about it, something unsettling. He could still feel it. In the pit of his stomach, deep within the corners of his mind, it was still there, waiting. It's not gone, Amelia. It's still here. I can feel it. Her face hardened. She nodded. I know. It's always been there, hasn't it? The dark force, the one pulling at the fabric of this world. It won't let go so easily. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze swept across the empty, shifting void around them, a place that seemed more like a fractured dream than reality. But somewhere, deep within the folds of this place, he could see it. The faintest sliver of light, like a door left ajar. Where does that lead? He asked, pointing toward the glow. Amelia turned to look, her brows furrowing. I'm not sure, but if it's our only way out, it's worth a shot. With no other choice, they moved toward the light, their steps tentative but steady. The closer they got, the more the shadows seemed to recoil, as if they feared whatever lay beyond the glowing threshold. But as they crossed the divide, a sudden pull of gravity yanked them forward. The ground below them seemed to melt away, and they were falling once more, spiraling through the emptiness. They landed with a jarring thud, the force knocking the air from their lungs. Ethan groaned as he pushed himself up, the world around him spinning. He blinked several times, his vision clearing as he took in his surroundings. They were no longer in the void. Instead, they were standing in a place that was hauntingly familiar. A room that looked like his childhood home, but distorted. The walls were cracked, the furniture shattered, as if the house had been abandoned for years. Dust clung to the air, and the light filtering through the broken windows cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Ethan's pulse quickened. He hadn't realized it at first, but now he saw it. There, in the corner of the room, the mirror. It was the same mirror from before. The one that had always been in the hallway of his childhood home. The same one that had haunted his dreams for years. His breath caught in his throat. He could hear the whisper again, faint at first, but growing louder by the second. You're mine now, Ethan. His mind reeled. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. His pulse quickened as he stepped toward the mirror, feeling an unnatural pull to it. We never truly left, the voice rasped, now clear and unmistakable. You belong to us. Amelia stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with determination. No. Ethan, listen to me. This is just a trick, a part of the darkness trying to get inside your head. But Ethan wasn't sure anymore. The mirror beckoned to him, the surface rippling like water, pulling him in. His reflection stared back at him. Not the reflection he had hoped for, but the twisted version of himself. The eyes that had once been hollow now gleamed with something far worse. It was the darkness. The image in the mirror grinned. You can't run from what you are, Ethan. You will join us just like the others. You have no choice. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he stepped closer. The air felt thick, oppressive. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn away, to fight. But his feet moved of their own accord. He could feel the presence of the darkness creeping into him, sinking into his skin like oil. He was losing himself again, just as he had in that void. Ethan, Amelia's voice cut through the haze. Fight it. This is not you. The mirror is just an illusion. It's all in your mind. Her words broke through, like a splash of cold water, pulling him back from the edge. He clenched his fists, his body shaking as he fought against the pull of the mirror. No, I won't let you in. I won't. The mirror crackled, its surface warping, distorting as if it too were fighting against him. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing his will upon the mirror. The shadows hissed in anger, and the air grew colder, the pressure mounting until his very bones ached. And then, in that moment of complete darkness, something changed. The whispers, the shadows, the oppressive presence, they all vanished. The mirror shattered, the glass splintering in all directions. Ethan stood panting, his heart racing in his chest, sweat running down his face. The world around him shifted again. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his childhood home. He wasn't in the void. He wasn't anywhere. He was standing in the middle of an endless, swirling darkness. He looked around, but there was no ground beneath him, no walls, no edges. Just a vast emptiness, stretching as far as the eye could see. And in the distance, just barely visible, he saw the faint outline of the figure once more, the one with the glowing red eyes. It was waiting for him. "This is where it ends, Ethan," the voice said, its tone low and full of finality. But Ethan stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the presence of the darkness, seeping into every corner of his mind, trying to break him again, but he wasn't going to let it win. Not this time. He had already faced the void. He had already seen the depths of his own fear. "No," Ethan whispered to himself, his voice steady. "This is where I make my stand." The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form shifting, growing more monstrous with each passing second. But Ethan didn't back down. He could feel the power within him, a strength he didn't understand but could no longer ignore. This time, the darkness would not consume him. This time, Ethan would fight until there was nothing left. The figure's laughter filled the endless void, echoing through the darkness like a thunderclap. Ethan could feel its malicious presence pressing in on him, an ancient, suffocating force determined to break him, to swallow him whole. Yet, despite the overwhelming dread that gripped his chest, Ethan stood firm, his fists clenched at his sides. He could hear Amelia's voice in his head, her words a steady rhythm that anchored him. "You are stronger than it. You have always been stronger. Don't let it define you." The figure advanced toward him, its glowing red eyes burning with rage. With each step, the very air seemed to vibrate, like the space around them was bending under the weight of its power. It was massive now, its features twisting and contorting into grotesque forms. The darkness itself swirling like a storm, chaotic and untamed. "You cannot defeat me, Ethan," the figure hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers, each one colder than the last. "I am the void. I am everything you fear. You will be consumed." But Ethan wasn't afraid anymore. He could feel the power that had awakened in him, something older, something stronger than the darkness. It was a fire, burning within him, fierce and relentless. The more he focused on it, the more it grew. And the shadows around him began to recoil, shrinking away from the light he was creating. "You're wrong," Ethan whispered, his voice steady and strong, carrying a weight of finality. "I am not afraid of you anymore." The figure's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the shadows wavered as if the very darkness itself hesitated. It recoiled, its monstrous form flickering in the light Ethan was conjuring, but only for an instant. "You think you've won?" It sneered. "This world is mine. I am the darkness you can never escape. I will always find you. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." Ethan felt the ground beneath him tremble, the very fabric of reality seeming to tear apart. The figure surged forward, its massive form wrapping around him like tendrils of shadow, trying to pull him into its embrace. But Ethan fought back with everything he had. He pushed outwards, his hands glowing with a fierce light, like rays of pure energy that burned through the darkness. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You can't control me. You can't have me." With a roar, the darkness surged toward him, its power crushing. But Ethan's light was stronger now, burning brighter than it ever had before. The shadow recoiled once more, screeching in fury, and for the first time, Ethan saw it. Just a fleeting moment, but it was enough. A crack, a tiny fracture in the very core of the darkness. It was afraid. "You cannot defeat me," the figure howled, its form unraveling, its grip on the world faltering. Ethan reached forward, his hands outstretched, and for a single, intense moment, he poured every ounce of his strength into that light. The air around him crackled, the very fabric of existence seemed to bend and twist, and the void split open with an ear-splitting crack. The figure screamed in agony as the light tore through it, ripping apart the darkness at its core. Ethan felt the force pushing back against him, but his resolve never wavered. He was no longer a vessel for fear. He was the force that would shatter it. "This is the end," he said, his voice filled with both defiance and finality. The shadow collapsed in on itself, its form disintegrating into nothingness, leaving behind only the remnants of its hollow, twisted whispers. The silence that followed was deafening, the void now empty, no longer pressing in around him. The air felt different now, lighter, cleaner. Ethan stood in the center of the emptiness, panting, the weight of his victory sinking in. He had done it. He had broken free. The darkness was gone. The battle was over. And yet, as he took a slow, deep breath, a flicker of doubt lingered in his mind. He knew that darkness was not something that could be truly vanquished. It would always find its way back. But for now, for this moment, he had won. A gentle hand rested on his shoulder, and he turned to see Amelia standing beside him, her face tired but resolute. There was something in her eyes, something that spoke of strength and resilience. She had stood by him through this whole nightmare, and together, they had won. "It's over," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan nodded, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. But he knew one thing for sure now. No matter how many battles awaited him, he would never be alone. The light around them began to grow, expanding outward, the boundaries of the void dissolving, replaced by a soft, warm glow that wrapped around them. In that moment, Ethan knew that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the strength that came from within, because he had faced the darkness, and he had survived. "Let's go home," he whispered, and as the light enveloped them both, the world shifted once again. The void disappeared, and the warmth of reality, of life, returned. For now, the darkness was gone. Ethan and Amelia stood together, the warmth of the light surrounding them like a protective cocoon. The remnants of the darkness had faded into the past, leaving behind only the faintest echoes in their minds. As they stood in silence, the air around them seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, as though the world itself had been freed from the grip of the void. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. His skin tingled, and though the light was bright, it felt distant, like it was flickering at the edge of his perception. It wasn't a darkness he could see, but a feeling, something waiting in the corners, patiently, as if it were simply biding its time. Amelia sensed it too. She turned to him, her brow furrowed, her expression wary. "Ethan, do you feel that?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like something isn't finished." They exchanged a look, both knowing that despite their victory, something still lingered. The fight against the darkness had been intense, and the battle had torn through the very fabric of their reality. But they had never faced a force like this before. This wasn't just some malevolent being or ancient evil. It was something far deeper, something that touched not just their world, but every world. "I thought we destroyed it," Amelia murmured. "How can it still be here?" Ethan's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the inexplicable feeling clawing at his consciousness. He reached for his wrist, the place where the mark had once burned. A reminder of the twisted, otherworldly force that had latched onto him. It had been a symbol of the darkness grip, a constant reminder that it was never truly gone. But now, the mark was gone. The burning sensation had disappeared when they shattered the mirror, when the last remnants of the entity were obliterated. "Maybe we did destroy it," Ethan said, though his voice held uncertainty. "But darkness doesn't die so easily. It always finds a way back, no matter how deep we bury it." Amelia's gaze darkened, and she clenched her fists. "Then we'll make sure it stays buried." The two of them began to walk, their footsteps echoing in the vast expanse of light that surrounded them. With every step, the light seemed to grow more intense, more blinding. But the unsettling sensation that something was wrong continued to press against them. The air was growing thick again, the brightness dimming, as though something was casting a shadow over the very light that had once offered them safety. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The light flickered once more, and then everything stopped. They were no longer in the comforting glow. The world around them shifted, and they found themselves standing in a new place, though it was eerily similar to where they had been. The walls were cracked, the floors broken, and a cold wind whipped through the air. The once bright, warm light had vanished, replaced by the deepening chill of an unfamiliar twilight. Amelia looked around in confusion. Where are we? Ethan didn't answer at first, his eyes scanning the surroundings. His heart sank as he recognized it. This was no new place. This was a version of his childhood home, just like the mirror had shown him. But it was different. The air was heavy, the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating and relentless. A creaking sound echoed from upstairs, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Ethan's breath hitched. No. He reached for Amelia's hand, gripping it tightly. We need to go. Now. But before they could take another step, the door to the hallway swung open with a violent bang. From the shadows, a figure emerged. Not the towering, grotesque creature they had fought before, but something far more horrifying. It was a reflection of Ethan. The figure was a twisted version of himself, dressed in tattered clothes, his eyes wide and unblinking. The thing, his reflection, smiled at him with a malevolent grin, the corners of its lips stretching unnaturally wide. It moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were stitched together from fragments of forgotten memories. Amelia stepped in front of Ethan, her eyes narrowing with defiance. It's not real. This is just another part of it trying to break you. But Ethan couldn't shake the fear that was crawling up his spine. This was him, but not him. It was a piece of the darkness, a manifestation of his own deepest, most buried fears. And that was the most terrifying part. You think you've escaped, the reflection hissed, its voice mocking, laced with venom. But you can never escape yourself. You are darkness. You are the void. You will always return to it. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in, suffocating him. The reflection stepped closer, its grin widening, the air growing colder with every step it took. Amelia, he said, his voice shaking. It's not real. It can't be. We've already beaten it. But his words felt hollow, as if even he didn't believe them. He wanted to fight, to stand tall and face this new manifestation of his own demons. But something in him, something deep inside, wanted to believe it. What if the darkness was right? What if he would always return to it? The reflection reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, brushing Ethan's cheek. You are mine, it whispered. In that moment, something inside of Ethan snapped. The terror that had been building inside him, the confusion, the doubt. It all crystallized into a single intense realization. He was not the reflection. The reflection was the lie, and it was time to destroy it once and for all. Ethan's heart raced as he stared into the cold, empty eyes of his twisted reflection. The air around him grew thick with dread, but amid the suffocating fear, something within him ignited, an undeniable spark of defiance. He clenched his fists, feeling the warmth of his powers stir in his chest, stronger now, clearer. The darkness that had once threatened to consume him was no longer in control. You're not me, Ethan said, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. You're just a part of it. You're nothing but a lie. The reflection's grin faltered, but it quickly regained its monstrous smile. A lie, it echoed, its voice now mockery. No, Ethan, you are the lie. You think you can escape, but you'll always be a part of this darkness. You can never outrun it. But Ethan didn't falter. He stepped forward, his feet moving with a purpose that surprised even him. Amelia stood beside him, her presence a quiet but unwavering strength. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. You're not alone in this, she whispered. We're in this together. We've always been. Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the twisted version of himself. Together, we can destroy it. With that, he took a deep breath and focused on the fire burning inside him. It was a warmth, a force that had been born in the deepest parts of his soul during the fight against the void. It was something pure, something untouchable by the darkness. He could feel it now, rising like a wave, breaking through the terror that had once clouded his mind. The reflection's grin twisted in anger, its features contorting as it tried to advance, but the light radiating from Ethan began to push it back, step by step. "No," the reflection shrieked, its voice warping with rage. "You are nothing without me. You can't defeat me. You are mine." But the more it screamed, the brighter the light grew, until the entire room was ablaze with brilliance. The walls shook, and the floor beneath them cracked, as if the very foundations of reality were splintering. The reflection stumbled backward, its form flickering like a candle flame, fighting against the intensity of Ethan's power. "I will not be controlled by you," Ethan shouted, his voice booming now, reverberating through the collapsing world. The light around him exploded in a brilliant flare, engulfing the reflection entirely. For a brief moment, the room seemed to stand still, silent, suspended in time. And then, with a deafening crack, the reflection shattered like glass, its form disintegrating into nothingness. The shadows that had clung to it evaporated in the blink of an eye, leaving only the warmth of the light. The silence that followed was profound, the air still and heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Ethan stood motionless, his breath shallow as he tried to steady his racing heart. Amelia stepped closer, her eyes scanning the empty room. Did it work? Ethan's chest rose and fell with a deep sigh as he turned to look at her. "I think so. I think we finally did it." But as he spoke, a tremor ran through the floor beneath them, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. Ethan's heart dropped into his stomach. Amelia's face paled. "No, it can't be." From the darkness, something moved. Slow, deliberate. A figure began to materialize in the center of the room, tall and ominous, its features concealed in shadow. Unlike the reflection, this presence felt ancient, a primal force that made the very air thick with malice. Its eyes glowed a deep, fiery red, 2 points of intense light that burned through the darkness. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He couldn't let this thing win. "You really thought you could destroy me?" The voice came, low and mocking. "You cannot kill what is eternal, Ethan. I am not a reflection. I am the darkness itself. And I am always with you. You cannot escape." Ethan gritted his teeth, his hands shaking at his sides. The warmth of the light inside him flickered, but it wasn't enough. This wasn't a mere illusion or a twisted reflection. This was the heart of the darkness itself, something more insidious than anything he had ever faced. Amelia stepped forward, her eyes narrowed with defiance. "We've already come this far," she said, her voice steady. "We've already defeated your shadows. We're not backing down now?" Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. She was right. This thing, this force, might be ancient and powerful, but it had no power over them. They had survived the void together. They had faced the shadows and come out stronger, and they weren't about to let it win now. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward. He could feel the power rising in him again, stronger than before. He focused, channeling everything he had left. The light, the strength, the fire that had once saved him from the abyss. And with one final determined cry, he released it. The light surged outward like a tidal wave, crashing against the darkness with an earth-shattering force. The figure screamed as the light consumed it, its form twisting, unraveling, and finally vanishing with a deafening roar. The world seemed to shudder, the very fabric of reality tearing apart one last time. Ethan braced himself, his arms raised as the power swept through the room. And then, with a final pulse, everything went silent. When he opened his eyes, the darkness was gone. The room was empty. The oppressive weight of the void lifted, and the air was clear. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Ethan stood there for a moment, stunned. He looked around, half expecting to see the shadows return. But there was nothing. Only the quiet. Amelia stepped beside him, her face weary but resolute. "Is it finally over?" Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the now peaceful surroundings. "I think it is." Together, they stood in the quiet aftermath of the battle they had fought, knowing that the darkness had been defeated. But in the back of Ethan's mind, a single thought lingered. One that would always be with him. Darkness never truly dies. But they had survived, and that was enough. The stillness around Ethan and Amelia was almost suffocating in its tranquility. The battle, the endless fight against the darkness, had left them exhausted, physically and mentally. They had won, yes, but there was a lingering sensation, an unsettling echo in the back of Ethan's mind that wouldn't let him forget the price of their victory. Amelia, too, seemed lost in her thoughts. Her eyes, once fierce with determination, now seemed weary. She looked over at Ethan, her gaze softening as if trying to reassure herself that the battle was truly over. But they both knew there was always a chance that darkness would return. Evil had a way of lingering in places they least expected. After a long pause, Ethan spoke, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "It's over. I know that." But Amelia sighed, her hand gently brushing against his. "You're still afraid it's not, aren't you?" He nodded, his gaze distant. "It feels too quiet. It's like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen." Amelia squeezed his hand. "You're right. It does feel like that. But maybe, just maybe, we've broken its hold on us. Maybe that's why it's so silent." Ethan wasn't sure if he believed her. The dark force they had fought had been so powerful, so persistent, that it felt impossible to think it was truly gone. They had destroyed its physical form, yes, but had they destroyed its essence? Had they severed its connection to the world, to their minds? Or was it simply lying dormant, biding its time until it could strike again? "I don't know," Ethan admitted quietly. "Part of me wants to believe it's over, that we're free. But another part of me feels like we're being watched, like there's something waiting." Amelia looked up at him, her expression thoughtful but resolute. "We've come this far, Ethan. We've faced the darkness, and we've beaten it." She paused, squeezing his hand again more firmly this time. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it together. That's the only thing that matters." Ethan turned to look at her, his expression softening. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that no matter what came next, they could face it. Together. But as they stood there, a faint whisper echoed through the silence. It was so soft, so distant, that at first, they thought it was just the wind. But then it came again, clearer this time. A low, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You can't escape. You never escape." The hair on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end, and Amelia's grip on his hand tightened. They both looked around, but there was nothing but the empty, silent space. "Did you hear that?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Amelia nodded, her face pale, eyes wide. "I heard it. It's impossible. We destroyed it." But the voice came again. This time louder, more forceful, as if it were coming from the very air around them. "You can't run from me. You belong to me. Always." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. No, it can't be." He turned to look at Amelia, but her face was ashen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Ethan, it's not over. It's not gone. It's still here." The world around them began to shift. The air growing colder, the light dimming as though something was draining the warmth from the room. The shadows began to twist and writhe, moving of their own accord, curling around the edges of their vision like dark tendrils reaching for them. Ethan took a step back, his breath shallow. "It's still here. It never left." The voice, now coming from all directions, seemed to close in on them. "I will always find you. I will always be there, lurking in the dark, waiting for you to falter. There is no escape." The darkness thickened, pressing in on them from all sides. It was no longer just a presence. It was an entity, one that had embedded itself so deeply into the very fabric of reality that it could no longer be separated from it. The room around them began to twist and distort, the walls bending as if they were made of liquid. The floor beneath them cracked open, revealing an endless, swirling abyss. "This is where it ends," the voice whispered, its tone sweet and deadly. "You are mine." But Ethan refused to give in. He couldn't. He wouldn't. He remembered the power he had tapped into before, the fire that had burned away the darkness, the light that had shattered the reflection. He had once wielded it with conviction. "No," his voice was firm, the words an anchor in the midst of the chaos. "We're not going back to that. We're not your prisoners." Amelia stepped forward beside him, her eyes filled with determination. "We are not alone. We will never be alone." Ethan reached deep inside, focusing on that same warmth, that same fierce light. The shadows pressed in, threatening to overwhelm him, but this time he was ready. With a deep breath, he unleashed the power. A blinding burst of light that cut through the darkness like a blade. For a moment, the world seemed to collapse in on itself, the light and dark battling for dominance. But then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, the tendrils unraveling, the shadows retreating as the light grew stronger, stronger. The voice screamed in fury, its words disintegrating into the ether. "You cannot destroy me." But Ethan didn't falter. The light grew brighter, more intense, and with a final explosive pulse, the darkness was gone. The world around them returned to stillness, the air clear and calm once more. Ethan stood, panting, sweat beading on his forehead. Amelia was beside him, her face determined but tired. "Is it over now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked around, the fear and doubt still lingering in the back of his mind. But he knew now. He had faced the darkness and, for now, he had defeated it. "For now," he said quietly. "But we'll always be ready. We'll never stop fighting." And as they stood together, the light growing warmer around them, they knew that no matter what came next, they would face it. Because the darkness could never truly claim them. It could only wait. The room was eerily still, the echoes of the vanquished darkness lingering like the fading notes of a somber song. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of the battle pressing on his chest. His eyes searched Amelia's face, finding in her expression the same weariness, the same shadow of fear. But beneath it, there was a spark, a shared resilience that had kept them alive until now. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the cracked window panes as if trying to break in. The world beyond seemed almost unchanged, indifferent to the supernatural battle that had unfolded within these walls. But Ethan knew better. The dark force they had faced was not bound by the limitations of reality. It was a predator lurking just beyond the veil, always watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. Amelia exhaled slowly, stepping to the window. Her fingers traced the frost-covered glass as her eyes swept the deserted street below. "It's quiet," she whispered, though the silence only made the tension more pronounced. Ethan joined her, peering into the shadows that stretched long and thin under the dim glow of the street lamps. The neighborhood, once a familiar backdrop to their lives, now felt like a stage where unseen eyes followed their every move. "Too quiet," he said, the unease coiling in his gut like a snake. He could feel the exhaustion tugging at him, but he wouldn't let himself rest. "Not yet." Amelia turned to him, her eyes serious. "We need to know more. If that was just part of it, then we need to find out what we're really up against." The thought sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He had hoped that defeating the reflection and that monstrous voice would have ended the nightmare. But it was clear now that they had only brushed against something much larger, much older. "I don't know where we even start," he admitted, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Whatever it is, it's been here longer than we have. It's like it's part of this place." Amelia's brows furrowed. "If it's as old as it feels, then there might be something. Records, stories, something buried in the town's history." Ethan nodded, the spark of determination in his eyes rekindling. "Then we go to the library. Old records, newspapers, anything that might give us a clue." The idea of leaving the relative safety of their home made his heart pound, but they couldn't afford to sit and wait for the darkness to strike again. They needed answers. The library was a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that hung over their small town. Rows of dusty bookshelves loomed around them, filled with the whispered knowledge of decades past. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, their cold glow casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Amelia rifled through old newspaper clippings while Ethan skimmed through a book on local folklore. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the floorboards. "Listen to this," Amelia said, breaking the quiet. Her voice was tight with barely contained urgency. She held up a yellowed newspaper clipping, the headline blurred by time. Disappearances at Black Hollow Manor remain unsolved. Ethan's eyes widened as he reached for the paper. The article detailed a string of strange disappearances dating back over a century, all connected to an old, abandoned mansion at the edge of town. Witnesses spoke of strange noises, whispers in the wind, and lights that moved of their own accord. Black Hollow Manor, he muttered. He had heard the name before, in passing, when the older townsfolk spoke in hushed tones as if uttering it would summon something sinister. That's where it's coming from. It has to be. Amelia nodded, the color draining from her face. If the darkness has roots there, then we have to go. We have to know what we're dealing with. The idea of facing whatever lay within that manor sent a chill down Ethan's spine. But he met Amelia's gaze, seeing the same determination reflected in her eyes. Then we go, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. But we go prepared. The journey to Black Hollow Manor was shrouded in silence. The road wound through the forest like a serpent, the trees crowding closer with each mile as if trying to dissuade them from their path. The manor loomed ahead, a forgotten relic of the past, its silhouette jagged and broken against the dark sky. They stepped from the car, the air thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. Ethan's hand found Amelia's, their fingers intertwining, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. The front doors creaked as they pushed them open, the sound reverberating through the vast empty halls like a warning. Dust motes floated lazily in the thin beams of moonlight that seeped through shattered windows, casting ghostly patterns on the floor. Ethan took a step forward, the wooden boards groaning under his weight. The air was colder inside, biting at his skin like icy fingers. This place, Amelia whispered, her voice trailing off as a shiver ran down her spine. Suddenly a sound, soft at first, then louder, filled the space around them. It was a rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat echoing from the walls themselves. The heartbeat-like sound echoed through the empty halls of Black Hollow Manor, a pulse that seemed to vibrate through the walls and floor. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, something alive and ancient, lurking in the shadows. Ethan's heart pounded in sync with the thumping, each beat pulling him deeper into the suffocating dread that clung to the air. Amelia's grip on his hand tightened, her knuckles white. She glanced at him, her eyes wide with fear, but burning with determination. "We have to keep going," she said, her voice just above a whisper, as if speaking louder might awaken whatever slumbered within the manor. Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry. "We need to find where it's coming from," he said, though every part of him wanted to turn and run. But they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. They moved cautiously, their footsteps barely more than a whisper against the creaking floorboards. The manor was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, each one filled with relics of a past that seemed to resent their intrusion. Dusty portraits with eyes that followed them, furniture draped in sheets that stirred like silent ghosts in the flickering light of their flashlights. The thumping grew louder as they descended deeper into the house, leading them to a grand staircase that spiraled down into darkness. Ethan hesitated at the top, the air around them thick with an almost tangible malice. "It's coming from below," Amelia said, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound brave. Ethan nodded, taking the first step down. The stairs groaned under their weight, the sound echoing like a warning. The heartbeat grew louder, almost deafening now, as if whatever awaited them below was awake and aware of their presence. They reached the bottom, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness to reveal a vast, forgotten cellar. The walls were lined with old stone, cracked and crawling with vines that seemed to move ever so slightly, like fingers reaching out for them. At the center of the room was an ancient altar, its surface at strange, twisting symbols that seemed to pulse with an unnatural glow. Amelia gasped, drawing Ethan's attention to the floor. A massive, dark stain spread out from the altar, a deep, inky blackness that seemed to drink in the light. The thumping sound was almost unbearable now, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. "This is it," Ethan said, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. "This is where it's been hiding." Suddenly, the thumping stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it made their ears ring. The air grew colder, and a low guttural voice resonated from the shadows around them. You dare come here? You seek to challenge what you cannot comprehend. Ethan's flashlight flickered as an oppressive darkness gathered around them, swallowing the edges of the room. A shape began to form above the altar, a shadow darker than the rest, with eyes that glowed a deep, malevolent red. Amelia stepped back, her breath caught in her throat. What is that? The entity shifted, its form becoming more defined. A towering figure with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift and twist, never holding one shape for more than a moment. It leaned forward, eyes narrowing as it focused on them. You've brought the light into my domain, but light is fleeting and darkness is eternal. Ethan felt a chill sweep over him, but something inside him pushed back against the fear. He reached out, feeling the warmth of that inner light, the fire that had fought the darkness before. But this time, it was different. The shadow before them was no mere echo or reflection. It was the source. We're not afraid of you, he said, though his voice wavered. The figure laughed, a sound like the rumble of distant thunder. Your defiance amuses me, but you will see that resistance is futile. Before they could react, the shadow surged, tendrils shooting out from the darkness, wrapping around their ankles and wrists, pulling them toward the altar. Amelia cried out as she struggled, the cold, inky vines tightening like a vice. Ethan, she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. Ethan fought against the tendrils, his mind racing. The warmth in his chest flickered, struggling against the weight of the darkness pressing in on him. He closed his eyes, focusing on the light, willing it to grow, to burn brighter. We will not be yours, he shouted, his voice carrying through the cellar. The warmth ignited into a blaze, searing through him and out into the room. The shadows recoiled with a hiss, the tendrils releasing their grip as the light erupted in a brilliant burst. The dark figure shrieked, its form splintering as the light cut through it, breaking it apart piece by piece. The thumping returned, frantic and uneven, as if the very heart of the manor was being torn apart. The ground shook beneath their feet, and cracks splintered across the walls. Ethan, we need to go, Amelia yelled, pulling him away from the altar as the entire room began to collapse. They stumbled up the stairs, the roar of destruction behind them as the manor groaned and crumbled. The heartbeat slowed, fading into silence as they burst through the front doors and into the cold night air. Turning back, they watched as Black Hollow Manor, once a fortress of darkness, fell in on itself, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and debris. Ethan and Amelia stood in the silence, their hands clasped tightly together. The air was clear, the oppressive weight lifted, but they knew this was not the end. The darkness had been pushed back, but it would always linger, waiting for another chance. But for now, they had won, and that was enough. As the dust settled, the once ominous silhouette of Black Hollow Manor was reduced to a jagged, crumbling heap. The moon cast an eerie glow over the ruins, bathing them in silvery light and making the twisted remains look almost peaceful. Ethan took in a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs but feeling fresher than anything he had ever breathed before. Amelia's hand, still clasped in his, trembled. Her eyes were fixed on the wreckage, as if waiting for something to emerge from it. Some last vestige of the darkness they had fought. But all that came was silence, a deep, unsettling quiet that pressed against their ears. Is it really over? Amelia whispered, breaking the stillness. There was hope in her voice, tentative and fragile. Ethan hesitated, scanning the ruins for any movement, any sign of the dark force they had faced. But the oppressive presence was gone, replaced by the subtle, familiar sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl. He squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. For now, it is. We've pushed it back, maybe even destroyed its hold on this place. They turned from the manor and began to walk back to their car. The path through the woods was lined with shadows, but they felt different now. Natural, non-threatening. Yet, as they walked, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was still watching, lurking just beyond the reach of the moonlight. What do we do now? Amelia asked, her voice louder now that they were farther from the ruins. The tremor was gone, replaced by a tired determination. We learn everything we can, Ethan said, glancing at her. There may be more places like Black Hollow. If the darkness is out there, we need to be ready. Amelia nodded, a flicker of resolve crossing her face. The experience had changed them. They were no longer just two people caught in a storm. They were survivors, warriors against an ancient, unknowable force. As they reached the car, the cold metal of the door handle bit into Ethan's hand, grounding him in the reality of the moment. He turned to look at the woods one last time, the shadows deep and shifting under the pale glow of the moon. "Do you think it will come back?" Amelia asked, following his gaze. "It might," Ethan admitted. "But next time, we'll be ready. And we won't be alone." The engine roared to life, the sound echoing off the trees as they drove away from Black Hollow Manor. Behind them, the ruins stood as a silent witness to their victory, a reminder that while darkness could be pushed back, it would always seek a way to return. And in the depths of the forest, where the moonlight could not reach, a whisper echoed, faint and fleeting. "We will meet again." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine, but he kept driving, eyes fixed ahead, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The road stretched out before them, a path that promised challenges, mysteries, and battles yet to come. But for now, there was peace, and that was enough.